I'm not a superstitious person. Never have been. I don't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that stuff. So when my professor assigned a photography project on local folklore, I figured it would be an easy A. I live in New Orleans, so finding spooky spots to shoot wasn't exactly a challenge. But I wanted something different, something that would stand out. That's how I ended up at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, the final resting place of the famous voodoo priestess, Marie Laveau. The cemetery is like a maze, with crumbling mausoleums stacked like puzzle pieces and pathways that feel almost too narrow. It's eerie during the day, but something about the place at dusk is downright chilling. I had heard the stories about Marie Laveau, how people still leave offerings at her tomb, hoping for her blessing, even though she died over a century ago. I wasn't expecting much when I visited, just some atmospheric shots of the old graves and maybe a bit of that historic charm. As I wandered through the cemetery, snapping pictures of angel statues draped in moss, I noticed an older woman watching me from a distance. She wore a white dress that seemed out of place against the backdrop of decaying stone. At first, I thought she was just another tourist, but she wasn't holding a camera or phone, just a small bundle of herbs wrapped in a faded red cloth. She never took her eyes off me, even when I moved deeper into the maze of crypts. Eventually, I stumbled upon a tomb that looked different from the others, less ornate, more neglected. Unlike the others, it didn't have any of the usual offerings, no beads, no coins, nothing. It looked almost forgotten. I set up my camera, aiming for the soft glow of the setting sun reflecting off the cracked marble. Just as I was about to take the shot, the woman appeared beside me as if she'd just materialized out of nowhere. "You don't want to photograph that one," she said in a low, raspy voice. I nearly dropped my camera. Up close, I noticed how her skin looked almost leathery, her eyes clouded yet somehow sharp. "Why not?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "That's a resting place, not a spectacle. The spirits don't like being disturbed," she whispered, her gaze never leaving the tomb. I'm not sure why I did it. Maybe it was because I didn't believe her, or maybe because part of me didn't want to admit I was a little spooked. But I snapped the photo anyway, right in front of her. As soon as I did, I felt a chill run down my spine, like someone had dumped ice water on me. The woman shook her head and murmured something under her breath before walking away, leaving me alone with the uneasy feeling that I'd made a mistake. Back at my apartment that night, I uploaded the photos to my computer. Most of them turned out fine, but when I opened the file from that unmarked tomb, my heart stopped. The picture was blurred, like something had moved right in front of the lens. But it wasn't just motion blur, it looked like a white shape, vaguely human, hovering just above the ground. Then I noticed something else. The woman in the white dress, she was in the corner of the photo, standing directly behind me. I couldn't remember her being there when I took the shot. I zoomed in, squinting at the screen, and that's when I noticed her face. It wasn't the same as I remembered. Her eyes looked sunken, her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a glitch in the camera. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see her in the room with me. The paranoia wouldn't leave me alone. I could feel her watching me, even though I was alone. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that horrific grin, her eyes boring into me. Around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard whispering coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I was too scared to check, so I just sat on my bed, listening, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. When I finally did get the courage to peek out, the hallway was empty, but the smell of sage lingered in the air, just like at the cemetery. I locked my door and sat up until the first light crept through the window. The next morning, I went back to the cemetery. I needed to know what I'd photographed. I asked the caretaker about the unmarked tomb, and his face turned pale. He told me that it was rumored to belong to one of Marie Laveau's descendants, a Mambo who had been cursed for practicing dark magic. No one knew her real name, and her tomb was purposely left unmarked to keep people from disturbing her spirit. I tried to explain about the woman in white, but he cut me off. "If you saw her, you need to be careful. They say the Mambo's spirit still roams, warning people to leave her in peace. Those who don't listen, they never find rest." That night, I deleted the photo. I didn't want any trace of that encounter. I haven't been back to the cemetery since, but sometimes I still see her in my dreams, smiling that unnatural smile, whispering in that raspy voice, "You should have listened." A few weeks passed, and life returned to normal, or at least I convinced myself it did. I buried the memory of that night deep, telling myself it was just a coincidence or a trick of the light. The woman in white, the distorted photo, it was all just a weird fluke. Then one evening, while I was editing a different set of photos, my computer froze. At first, I thought it was just another crash. My old laptop had been acting up for months. But when the screen flickered back to life, the image of the unmarked tomb appeared on the screen. I hadn't saved it. I deleted it weeks ago, even emptied the recycle bin. Yet here it was, clear as day. The woman's face looked even more distorted this time, her grin wider, as if she knew I couldn't escape her. I slammed the lid shut, heart pounding, convinced it was just a computer glitch or some corrupted file. That night, the whispering returned, but louder. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It seemed to seep from the walls, a rhythmic chant that I couldn't understand. I huddled under my blankets, willing it to stop, but it went on for hours, fading just before dawn. The next day, I decided to wipe my hard drive and reinstall everything, desperate to get rid of that photo for good. I backed up my important files to an external drive, triple-checked to make sure the cursed image wasn't among them, and reset my laptop. For a few days, the silence was blissful. I started to believe that it was finally over, that whatever had haunted me had stayed behind with the wiped files. Until I found the photograph again, not on my laptop this time, but printed and taped to my front door. My hand shook as I peeled it off, staring at the grainy print. The woman's face was closer now, almost as if she had stepped right up to the lens. The words, "You should have listened," were scrawled underneath in faded red ink. I looked around my empty hallway, trying to figure out who could have done this. None of my neighbors were the prankster type, and I couldn't imagine anyone going out of their way just to mess with me. I called the building manager, but the security cameras hadn't picked up anything unusual. That night, the chanting came back, but this time it was inside my apartment. It was low at first, almost like humming, then grew louder and louder until it was a full chorus, echoing off the walls. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't muffle the sound. I could make out words now, something about a promise, about respecting the dead. When I couldn't take it anymore, I shouted, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disrespect her." Instantly, the noise stopped. The silence was so complete it felt suffocating. I sat on the floor, breathless and drenched in sweat, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, closer than ever, her eyes now wide and milky, lips stretched so unnaturally that it looked like her cheeks would tear. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I called a friend, Jake, who lived across town, and practically begged to crash at his place. I didn't tell him the whole story, just that I was having some weird issues at my apartment. He agreed without asking questions. When I got to Jake's, I collapsed on his couch, too exhausted to even make small talk. Just as I started to drift off, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, and my stomach dropped. It was a photo text from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, my hands shaking. It was the same image, the woman in white, closer than ever, her face filling the entire frame, teeth bared in that grotesque smile. I deleted it immediately, but within seconds, it appeared again. This time, the text underneath read, "You can't run from a promise." I dropped the phone like it was on fire. Jake noticed my panic and asked what was going on. I couldn't bring myself to tell him everything, just that I was being stalked by someone and didn't know how they kept finding me. He suggested going to the police, but I didn't know what to say, that I was being haunted by a photo. The final straw came the next night. Jake had gone out to grab food, leaving me alone in his apartment. I was trying to convince myself to take a nap when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic knock at the window. Jake's apartment was on the 3rd floor. I pulled back the curtain, heart in my throat. There she was, standing on the fire escape, staring right at me with that horrible grin. Her hands were pressed against the glass, and her lips were moving, forming words I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, and when I looked again, she was gone. When Jake returned, he found me huddled in the corner, barely coherent. He had to practically drag me to the car. We drove aimlessly for hours until I finally calmed down enough to speak. I knew I couldn't go back, not to my apartment, not to his. Whatever I'd done, whatever promise I'd broken, it wouldn't let me go. Jake dropped me off at a motel outside the city, and I paid in cash, too paranoid to leave any kind of trail. It's been 3 months. I moved from place to place, never staying more than a few days. I haven't heard the chanting since that night, but I still see her sometimes, in a reflection, a passing face in a crowd, always smiling. I know now that some promises can't be broken. I should have listened. Working as a tour guide in New Orleans is usually pretty straightforward. You memorize the stories, deliver them with some flair, and try not to let the more skeptical tourists get under your skin. But every once in a while, you get a gig that doesn't feel quite right. It started with a call from my boss, Greg, who ran one of the more reputable haunted history tour companies in the French Quarter. He sounded a bit uneasy, which wasn't like him. Greg was one of those guys who could make a murder scene sound like a bedtime story, but this time, his voice was low and hesitant. "Evan, I've got a private gig for you," he said. "You're my best storyteller. It's late, but the pay's good. Really good. Private gigs aren't that uncommon, especially during tourist season. Bachelorette parties, birthday celebrations, even corporate groups looking for some spooky entertainment." I asked where the tour would be, and when he said LaLaurie Mansion, I hesitated. Everyone knows about the LaLaurie Mansion, infamous for the gruesome discoveries made when a fire broke out in the 1830s. It's one of those places that locals treat with a weird kind of respect, like you don't mess with it because of the dark energy still lingering there. The current owner doesn't open it to the public, and tours usually just stop outside the gates. Greg cleared his throat. "It's a private event. A wealthy group. They rented the whole place out for the night. Just tell the usual stories: Marie Delphine LaLaurie, the fire, the tortured slaves. They want atmosphere. You'll meet them at midnight." The money was too good to pass up, so I agreed. I figured it would be like any other ghost tour. A bit creepy, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle. When I arrived at the mansion, the streets were unusually empty. The air was thick with humidity, and the wrought iron gates loomed taller than I remembered. A sleek black car was parked outside, and a man in a long coat, wearing a gold-plated mask, motioned me inside without a word. The interior was almost surreal: dim lighting, heavy drapes, and an overpowering scent of incense. I counted about a dozen guests, all wearing elaborate, ornate masks that glinted in the flickering candlelight. One of them, a tall man in a raven mask, gestured for me to start. I began with the story everyone knows: how Madame LaLaurie was once a respected member of high society, known for her lavish parties, until that fire revealed her secret, a hidden chamber filled with tortured slaves. As I spoke, I noticed the guests seemed unusually captivated, not just by the story, but by the mansion itself. Their eyes, or at least the glint from their masks, never left me. After a while, one of the guests, a woman in a silver fox mask, interrupted. "Tell us about the rituals," she said, her voice low and smooth. I hesitated, trying to recall any mention of rituals associated with the mansion. Some legends claim that Madame LaLaurie practiced dark magic, but there's no real evidence of that," I said, trying to steer back to safer ground. Another guest, wearing a lion mask, leaned in closer. "Not her rituals. The ones held after her departure. The gatherings of power. The offerings." I didn't know what to say. I'd never heard that version of the story, and something about the way he said offerings sent a shiver through me. I was about to ask for more information when the tall man in the raven mask tapped my shoulder. "Let's move upstairs," he said. They led me through the narrow corridors, up a winding staircase, and into a grand but decayed ballroom. The scent of old wood and dust filled the air. In the center of the room stood a long, dark wooden table. As they took their seats, I noticed something odd. One chair remained empty, positioned directly across from me. The raven-masked man gestured for me to continue, so I did, recounting the discovery of the chained slaves, the horrific injuries, and Madame LaLaurie's escape from the mob. The whole time, the masked guests seemed almost entranced, nodding slowly, like they were savoring every word. Then, one of them, a man in a stag mask, leaned forward. "Do you know why the spirits linger here?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. I opened my mouth to answer when the light suddenly dimmed, plunging the room into near darkness. In the glow of the few remaining candles, I saw the guests all turn their heads toward the empty chair. My heart pounded, and for a moment, I swore I saw the outline of a figure sitting there, watching me. The raven-masked man spoke again, his voice eerily clear. "Some say that those who disturb the past become part of it. That which was unfinished demands completion. You came here willingly, didn't you?" I nodded, too uneasy to speak. The room felt colder, and I could hear faint murmurs, as if the walls themselves were whispering. The woman in the fox mask began humming softly, and the rest joined in, their voices blending into a low, rhythmic chant. Then, without warning, one of the masked guests stood and approached the empty chair. He placed a hand on its back and whispered something I couldn't hear. Suddenly, the hum stopped, and all eyes were on me. The raven-masked man leaned in closer, so near I could feel his breath. "You are our guide," he said. "And tonight, we will follow you, to the end." A loud crash echoed from the hallway, like something heavy being dragged. I whipped my head around, but the guest remained eerily still. I looked back, and the raven-masked man's mask had changed. Its beak appeared longer, sharper, almost like a real bird's. I blinked, and it was normal again. Before I could react, the chanting resumed, louder now, echoing through the mansion. I felt trapped, like the walls were closing in. I tried to move, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Then, I saw it, a shadow slipping into the ballroom from the hall, tall and gaunt, its face hidden in darkness. The masked guests didn't seem alarmed. In fact, they looked almost expectant. The raven-masked man gripped my shoulder, his voice low and ominous. "It's time to welcome our guest of honor." I didn't understand. I was the guide. Who was the guest? And why did I feel like I was the one being led to something final? I wanted to run. I knew I should have left the moment the atmosphere shifted, but my feet wouldn't move. The guests remained perfectly still, their masked faces turned toward the shadowy figure inching into the ballroom. It was tall, unnaturally so, with a flowing dark coat that seemed to absorb the dim light around it. The only sound was the steady hum from the masked guests, rising and falling in eerie harmony. The figure stopped just inside the doorway, and I noticed something off. Its head was tilted, almost bird-like, as if assessing the room. I couldn't make out any features beneath the hood. The raven-masked man stepped forward and bowed slightly, gesturing to the empty chair at the head of the table. "It's good to have you with us," he intoned, voice softer now, almost reverent. The figure didn't respond, just glided to the chair and sat. It moved with an unsettling grace, as if it wasn't quite human. The woman in the fox mask spoke up. "Guide, tell our guest about the aftermath. About those who linger." I tried to speak, but my mouth had gone dry. I swallowed hard and forced myself to continue the story. After the fire revealed Madame LaLaurie's atrocities, the house was abandoned for years. People claimed to hear screams, chains rattling, and see shadows moving through the windows. Some say the spirits of the tortured slaves remained, unable to find peace. The guests seemed almost to purr in approval, nodding in unison. I glanced at the dark figure at the head of the table. It was perfectly still, like a statue. The raven-masked man leaned toward me, his voice almost a whisper. "Tell us, Evan, do you believe the spirits can be appeased?" I don't know," I stammered, my heart pounding. He didn't respond. Instead, he gestured for one of the others to continue the chant. The guests rose from their seats, forming a circle around the table, leaving me and the figure alone in the center. I wanted to scream, to bolt for the door, but something kept me rooted. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't just them. It was the mansion itself, groaning like the building was alive. The figures had shifted, revealing a glimpse of pale, waxy skin and hollow eyes. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The raven-masked man approached me again, his eyes glinting through the mask's narrow slits. "You wanted to tell stories, didn't you?" he whispered. "To connect with the past? You are the perfect guide. You will show them the way." I don't understand." I managed to choke out. He placed a cold hand on my shoulder. "The mansion remembers. It knows when someone truly believes in its history. You brought life to the tales. Now, you must join them." Suddenly, the figure at the table moved, its head snapping toward me. I saw its eyes, dark, sunken voids that seemed to suck in the light. The chanting grew frantic, almost desperate, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was trying to claw its way inside me. Desperate, I broke free from the raven-masked man's grip and stumbled backward. The guests didn't try to stop me. They just watched as I scrambled to the door. I threw it open and sprinted down the stairs, barely noticing how the walls seemed to pulse, like the mansion itself was breathing. When I reached the main hallway, the front door was gone. I spun around, disoriented, and found myself staring at a corridor that shouldn't have been there. The wallpaper was peeling, covered in strange, cryptic symbols, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Then I heard the dragging sound again, slow, rhythmic, coming from the end of the corridor. I backed away, feeling for another door, another exit, but the walls seemed to close in. In my panic, I called out, hoping someone from outside would hear me. My voice echoed back, distorted and wrong. A hand grasped my shoulder. I spun around, ready to fight, but it was the woman in the fox mask. She didn't seem hostile, just sad. "You can't leave," she whispered. "Once you're chosen, the mansion doesn't let you go." I shoved past her, trying every door I could find, but they all led to the same corridor, looping back on itself. The humming grew louder, accompanied by faint screams and the sound of chains. I knew I had to find the original ballroom, Had to confront whatever that figure was. When I burst back through the ballroom doors, the guests were gone. The room was completely empty, except for the figure still sitting at the table, waiting. I forced myself to approach, trembling, and sat in the chair opposite it. It leaned forward, and I could finally see its face, pale, gaunt, with a wide, grotesque smile. It spoke in a voice that was both male and female, soft and harsh. You wanted to know the truth. The stories are not just history. They're alive. And now, so are you. The figure reached out, its hand brushing mine. Pain shot through my body, and I saw flashes of people dancing, chained to the walls, their masks fused to their faces, screaming for freedom. I saw Madame LaLaurie, her eyes wild, her laughter echoing through the mansion as she watched the suffering unfold. When I woke up, I was outside on the curb, the morning sun creeping over the rooftops. My clothes were filthy, my phone dead. I stumbled to a cafe and asked what time it was. The barista looked at me like I was crazy. It's Friday, she said. You okay? You look like you've been out here for days. I checked my phone. The last call from Greg was 3 nights ago. I didn't remember anything after the ballroom. I went back to the office to confront him, but he claimed he never set up any private tour. Said I hadn't shown up to work in 3 days and he'd assumed I'd quit. Now, every night, I dream of the mansion. I hear the chanting, feel that cold grip on my shoulder. Sometimes I wake up and swear I see the raven-masked man standing at the foot of my bed, his hollow eyes watching, waiting. I've tried to leave New Orleans, but every time I pack up, I find a mask in my suitcase, the same ornate raven mask from that night. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape. The mansion doesn't let go once it's chosen you. I should never have taken that tour. I had been working as a caretaker at Oak Alley Plantation for about 3 months when I first noticed the carvings. At first, I thought they were just initials, something left behind by bored tourists who didn't care about the preservation of the historic site. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't letters at all. They were symbols, jagged and crude, gouged deep into the bark of the ancient live oaks that line the iconic pathway to the mansion. My job at Oak Alley was pretty straightforward. Keep the grounds tidy, make minor repairs, and keep an eye out for vandals or trespassers. The plantation attracted all sorts, history buffs, tourists, ghost hunters. Most visitors left before dusk, but sometimes you'd catch someone lingering after hours, hoping for a spooky encounter. One evening, just as the sky was fading into shades of lavender and gold, I was walking down the path to lock up the gates when I spotted the first symbol. It looked like a circle with a line slashed through it, almost like a zero being crossed out. Curious, I leaned closer and ran my fingers over the rough etching. It was fresh. I could still see tiny bits of bark scattered at the base of the trunk. I made a mental note to report it the next morning. I figured it was probably some teenage prank, kids from the area sneaking in to mess around. I scraped at it with my pocket knife, but it wouldn't budge. I moved on, telling myself I'd take care of it later. The next day, there were more symbols. Not just on one tree, but on several, each one different. A triangle with a slash through it, an hourglass shape, and what looked like a crooked X. I walked the entire length of the path and counted at least a dozen of them. I wasn't sure what they meant, but they gave me an uneasy feeling. I mentioned it to Janine, the site manager, when she came in the next morning. She raised an eyebrow and gave me a tired smile. Probably just kids, she said. Let's scrub them off before the weekend tours. It took me the better part of the day to clean the markings, using a wire brush and some mild solvent. I had just finished when I saw something that made my stomach drop, a new symbol on a tree I had just cleaned. It hadn't been there an hour earlier. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. That night, I decided to stick around past my usual hours. I parked my truck farther back, where it wouldn't be visible from the road, and waited. Around midnight, just when I was starting to think it was a waste of time, I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. I squinted through the darkness, trying to make out the figure. It was a man, tall and wearing dark clothes. He moved along the path, pausing at each tree, touching the bark as if inspecting the symbols. I crept closer, careful not to make a sound, and watched as he pulled a knife from his pocket and started carving a new mark into one of the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to confront him, but something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic, made me hesitate. Just as I gathered the nerve to approach, he suddenly stopped and looked directly in my direction. I ducked behind a tree, barely daring to breathe. I could hear him whispering something under his breath, but the words were too soft to make out. After a few minutes, he moved on, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the window of the caretaker's cabin, eyes fixed on the path. By dawn, I felt foolish for not having called the police, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just simple vandalism. The next morning, I checked the spot where I'd seen him carving. The new symbol was a spiral, neat and precise, and there was something else, a small pile of salt at the base of the tree. I bent down, brushing my fingers through it, and noticed something half buried, a small bone, bleached white. That day, I told Janine everything, but she seemed more annoyed than concerned. "We'll increase security," she said. Probably just some local weirdo with too much time on his hands. But I knew it was more than that. That night, I stayed late again, but this time, I wasn't alone. I'd convinced James, one of the other caretakers, to stick around with me. We took turns patrolling the grounds, but the night was silent. No strange figures, no new symbols. Just as we were about to call it quits, I noticed something odd. One of the oaks at the far end of the path had a faint light behind it. We approached cautiously, and as we got closer, we saw it, a small lantern hanging from a low branch. Beneath it was another pile of salt, this one larger, forming a circle. Inside the circle were more bones, arranged in the shape of a star. James swore under his breath and pulled out his phone to call the sheriff. As he dialed, we heard a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the woods. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. We shone our flashlights into the trees, but the chanting stopped abruptly. The sheriff arrived about 20 minutes later, and by then, the lantern had gone out. They didn't find any signs of the man I'd seen or anyone else. They took some photos and made notes, but without catching anyone in the act, there wasn't much they could do. After that night, the symbol stopped appearing, but the path didn't feel the same. Walking down it in the early morning light, I couldn't help but feel watched, like those old oaks were holding on to something dark, something they didn't want to let go of. And sometimes, even weeks later, I still found small piles of salt around the property, always at the base of the oldest trees, always in the shape of a circle. I never saw the man again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he'd started wasn't finished. A few weeks passed, and despite the eerie incident, life at Oak Alley Plantation seemed to settle back to normal. Janine brought in extra security for a few nights, but when nothing else happened, they cut back to the usual routine. I tried to convince myself it was just some local nut playing games, but the uneasiness wouldn't leave me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching me. I know how crazy that sounds, but every time I walked down the path, it felt like the oaks were bending closer, their long branches stretching toward me. Maybe it was just paranoia, but I started taking different routes around the property, avoiding the path whenever possible. One evening, while cleaning up after a private event in the main house, I found a crumpled piece of paper tucked behind one of the antique chairs. It was covered in those same strange symbols I had seen carved into the trees. My heart pounded as I smoothed it out, trying to make sense of it. In the center of the page, circled repeatedly, was the spiral symbol, the same one I'd seen the man carve that night. Just then, James walked in, startling me. I shoved the paper into my pocket, not wanting to sound paranoid again. "You all right?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The paper was sitting on my nightstand, taunting me with its cryptic marks. I decided to do some digging, hoping to find a logical explanation. A quick internet search didn't turn up much, but eventually, I found a local folklore forum discussing strange symbols that had appeared around plantations in Louisiana. One comment caught my attention. Symbols are a mark of ownership. You see them near old plantation grounds, places with dark history. Sometimes it's cults, sometimes just people trying to claim something. But the spiral, that's bad news. It's said to invite something back. I couldn't sleep after that. I kept thinking about the man with the knife, the salt circles, the chanting in the woods. It didn't make sense, but it felt like something was trying to root itself here, like those ancient oaks weren't just trees but witnesses to something dark. The next morning, as I was checking the grounds, I found another symbol. This time, it wasn't on a tree, it was etched into the dirt near the base of one of the statues. I couldn't believe it. I had just cleaned that spot yesterday. Whatever this was, it was happening under my nose. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, I heard footsteps on the path. I hid behind one of the thick oak trunks, heart racing. The man from before appeared, his face partially obscured by a hood. He was whispering to himself, running his hand over the tree bark as if searching for something. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Then, from behind me, I heard a low whisper, "He's marked you." I spun around, but no one was there. When I turned back, the man was gone too. I didn't know what to do, so I called James and asked him to come out to the grounds. I didn't tell him everything, just that I needed backup. He showed up with a six-pack and a smirk, thinking I was just spooked from working too many late shifts. We sat on the steps of the old slave quarters, drinking beer and keeping an eye on the path. Around midnight, we heard it again, that soft, rhythmic chanting coming from deeper in the woods. James looked at me, his smirk fading. "You weren't kidding," he whispered. We followed the sound, keeping our flashlights low. The chanting got louder, more intense, and as we rounded a bend, we saw them, a group of figures standing in a clearing, their backs to us. They were drawing symbols on the ground, forming a massive spiral pattern with salt. At the center of the spiral was a wooden effigy, bound with twine and draped in old cloth. James whispered, "We need to call the cops." But just then, one of the figures looked over his shoulder, and I froze. It was the same man from before, his face partially illuminated by the lantern light. He grinned, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. Before we could move, the chanting stopped, and the man stepped forward, raising a knife above the effigy. "By the roots and the ancient earth, we bind what was undone," he intoned, and the rest of the group echoed the words. James tugged my arm. "We gotta get out of here." But as we turned to leave, one of the trees creaked, its branches shifting unnaturally, almost like they were reaching for us. I swore I saw something moving within the dense foliage, a pair of eyes, watching intently. The air around us felt thick and oppressive, like it was pushing down on my chest. We didn't stop running until we were back at the cabin. I locked the door and pulled the curtains, half expecting those masked figures to come pounding on the windows. James looked at me, eyes wide with fear. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. I pulled the paper with the symbols from my pocket and showed it to him. He looked pale. "You're telling me you found that in the house?" "Yeah," I replied. "They're not just carving the trees. They're trying to tie something to the land." That night, neither of us slept. In the early morning light, we went back to the clearing, but it was empty. No symbols, no effigy, just disturbed dirt and the faint smell of smoke. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That a group of strangers was performing rituals in the woods? I decided to quit my job the next day. James didn't argue, said he'd cover for me. As I packed up, I found something on the floor near my bed, a small twig doll, tied with twine. It was identical to the effigy I had seen the night before. I burned it in the fire pit out back, but as the flames consumed it, I swore I heard whispering carried on the wind. I didn't stick around to listen. As I drove away from Oak Alley, I couldn't help but glance back at the old trees, their branches arched like bent fingers, protecting the path. Or maybe trapping it. Whatever those people were doing, I wasn't about to wait around to find out. Sometimes, I still dream about that night, the chanting, the spiral, and those eyes in the trees, watching me. I don't know what they were trying to awaken, but I have a feeling it's something that should have stayed buried. Taking the renovation job at Lloyd Hall Plantation seemed like a good idea at the time. The pay was decent, and I'd always liked old houses. There was something about bringing history back to life that made the long hours worthwhile. Plus, the place had character, sprawling oaks draped with Spanish moss, creaky wooden floors, and that eerie, atmospheric charm only centuries-old buildings seemed to possess. I'd heard the stories, of course. How the original owner was hanged by Union soldiers for being a double agent during the Civil War. How a deserter soldier was found dead in the attic. I didn't buy into the haunted house stuff, though. Just local legends. One afternoon, I was up in the attic, clearing out rotted beams and replacing loose floorboards. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming. I was just about to wrap up for the day when my boot hit something hollow. Curious, I knelt down and pried up the warp board. Beneath it was a rusted metal ring attached to a trapdoor I hadn't noticed before. It took some effort, but I managed to pull it open. The smell that wafted up was worse than anything I'd encountered so far, old, musty, and faintly like burnt wood. I aimed my flashlight into the hole, expecting to see storage space, but instead, I saw a bundle of cloth wedged in the corner. Reaching in, I pulled it out and found that it was an old, leather-bound journal wrapped in a faded Union jacket. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped it open. The handwriting was cramped and messy, but readable. The first few pages were mundane, notes about patrol duties and supply shortages. Then the tone shifted. August 3rd, 1864. They've moved me up to the attic to keep watch. The captain says we're to look for signs of desertion among the men. Can't say I blame anyone for wanting to leave. We've been stationed here too long. But there's something strange about this place. Last night, I thought I saw a man hanging from the rafters. When I went to check, the room was empty. Just the wind, I reckon. I swallowed hard, a prickly sensation creeping down my spine. I scanned the attic, half expecting to see the outline of someone hanging in the shadows. Nothing. Just cobwebs and dust. I read on. August 10th, 1864. Smith is missing. No one knows where he went. Some of the men say he left in the night, but I saw his boots by the attic door this morning. I don't like it up here. It's too quiet. Sometimes I hear ropes creaking when the wind isn't blowing. My flashlight flickered, and I tapped it, forcing it back to life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced at the rafters, scanning for anything out of place, but everything looked normal. I stuffed the journal into my backpack, feeling like I'd stumbled onto something I shouldn't have. I didn't plan to mention it to the site manager. It wasn't technically part of the job to catalog old junk, and something about that book just didn't sit right. That night, back at the caretaker's cabin, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that trapdoor, the journal, and the soldier who had written those words. Around midnight, I heard something faint from outside, a creaking noise, rhythmic and steady. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind moving the old branches, but the sound persisted. When I finally worked up the courage to check, I found nothing unusual outside. Just darkness and the distant hum of crickets. I locked the door and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I returned to the attic to continue repairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The trapdoor was open. I was sure I'd closed it the day before. I knelt down, peering into the hole. The cloth and jacket were gone, but the journal was still there, lying open to a new page I hadn't read. The ink was darker, as if fresher, and the words were frantic. August 15th, 1864. They found him hanging this morning. Said it looked like suicide, but I know better. No rope burns on his hands, no sign of struggle. Just swinging from the rafter, eyes wide open. The others think it's just bad luck, but I've seen that man before. The one in the shadows. He watches from the corner, and when you look, he's gone. I shivered, my skin prickling with goosebumps. Just then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a rope creaking above me. My heart pounded as I slowly lifted my gaze to the rafters. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a figure swaying gently, a dark silhouette. But when I blinked, it was gone. I scrambled down the ladder, too spooked to stay any longer. I went straight to Janine, the project manager, and tried to explain, but she just waved it off. Old houses make noises, she said. Probably just a draft. Stop worrying and get back to work. That night, back at the cabin, I tried to forget about it. I didn't even look at the journal again, just shoved it in my backpack. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of something dragging across the cabin roof. I froze, listening. It moved from one end to the other, slow and deliberate, like someone was pulling something heavy. Summoning every bit of courage I had, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The yard was empty, just the wind stirring the leaves. Then I looked up. Dangling from the roof beam was a length of old rope, frayed and swaying gently. My stomach dropped as I realized it hadn't been there earlier. I reached up, grabbing it to see if it was just a stray piece from the renovation. As I tugged, the knot gave way, and the rope fell at my feet, still tied in a noose. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I packed up and left without saying goodbye. As I drove away, I glanced back at the plantation. There, in the attic window, I swore I saw a silhouette, a figure with its head slightly tilted, watching me go. I still think about that journal sometimes, and I wonder if whatever haunted that soldier still lingers in the shadows of Lloyd Hall. I never found out who else read it after me. All I know is, I won't be going back. I left Lloyd Hall that morning, convinced I was done with the place. I didn't care about the paycheck or finishing the job. The sight of that noose dangling from the roof beam was enough to make my decision. I drove into town and checked into a cheap motel, hoping that putting some distance between me and the plantation would help me get a decent night's sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept replaying that moment in the attic, the trapdoor opened, the journal flipped to a new page, and that brief glimpse of something swinging from the rafters. I kept telling myself it was just fatigue, maybe even my imagination running wild after reading those eerie journal entries. I decided to go through the journal one last time before turning it over to someone else, maybe the local historical society. Maybe they could make sense of it. I pulled it out of my backpack and flipped to the last few pages. The handwriting had changed, like it was rushed or written by someone in a panic. August 18th, 1864. I don't know how much longer I can stay in this place. Last night, I heard it again, the sound of the rope creaking, but this time it was closer. The captain doesn't believe me. Says I'm just jumpy from the war. But I saw him, the hanging man. He's not dead. Not really. He watches from the corner. When I blink, he's gone. I swear to God, he's coming for me. I shut the journal, trying to control the tremble in my hands. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever haunted that soldier might still be there, watching. I thought about calling Janine and warning her, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Besides, she hadn't believed me the first time. That night at the motel, I thought I'd finally gotten some peace. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a loud banging on my motel door. I jumped up, heart pounding, and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I opened the door cautiously, but there was no one there. Just a folded piece of paper on the ground. I picked it up and unfolded it. Scrawled in large, messy letters were the words, "He sees you." I felt a wave of nausea. I was sure I had locked the door before going to bed. I stepped outside, looking up and down the hall, but it was deserted. I hurried back inside, double-locking the door this time. I wanted to believe it was just a prank, maybe one of the other workers messing with me for leaving the job. But I knew deep down that wasn't it. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the note, replaying everything that had happened. Around 4 a.m., I heard it again, that rhythmic creaking sound, like a rope swaying back and forth. It wasn't from outside. It was coming from the room above me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my stuff, threw it into my bag, and drove to the nearest diner, planning to wait there until sunrise. As I sat at the counter, drinking cup after cup of coffee, I thought about the journal. Maybe I'd stumbled onto something I shouldn't have. Maybe the man in the attic hadn't just died there. Maybe his spirit was still trapped, angry at being forgotten. I opened the journal again, determined to finish reading it. One of the final entries made my stomach twist. August 20th, 1864. I can't stay here. Last night, I heard him whispering my name. I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw it, the noose hanging from the rafter, swinging back and forth, but no one there. This morning, the captain found the trapdoor open. I didn't tell him about the figure in the corner, watching me. He wouldn't believe me anyway. Tonight, I'm leaving. I don't care if they call me a deserter. Better that than ending up like him. The next page was blank, and the few after that were torn out. I wondered if the soldier had actually made it out or if he'd met the same fate as the others. While I was sitting there, Janine called me. I hesitated before answering. "Evan," she said, sounding more serious than usual. "You left something in the attic." I froze. "What do you mean?" One of the guys found a length of rope tied to the rafter. Looked like it was just hanging there, swinging. Thought you might know something about it. I swallowed hard. I didn't leave any rope. I swear. She was quiet for a moment. They also found something else. An old boot. Military issue from the Civil War. It was just lying on the floor under the rafter. Looked like it had been there a long time, but... Evan, there was fresh mud on the sole. I didn't know what to say. I hung up, my hands trembling. I looked back at the journal, and something caught my eye. There was a faint watermark on the last page, the shape of a boot print, smudged and dirty. That's when it hit me. The night I opened the trapdoor, I had pulled out the jacket. The same jacket the soldier had wrapped the journal in. Had I disturbed something by moving it? Released whatever had been trapped there? I never went back to Lloyd Hall. I quit the job over the phone and left town. A few months later, I heard that the renovations had been put on hold. Apparently, workers kept hearing strange noises from the attic, creaking sounds, like rope rubbing against wood. One guy even claimed to see a figure standing at the attic window, swaying slightly, like he was hanging from the rafters. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that rhythmic creaking in my head. I try to convince myself it's just stress, that the mind plays tricks on you after a scare like that. But every now and then, when I'm alone and it's too quiet, I catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, a tall figure, head tilted, watching me. I never should have opened that trapdoor. Growing up in Louisiana, you hear a lot of stories about Manchac Swamp. Some people call it the Ghost Swamp because of all the legends, the haunted village that sank into the bayou, the voodoo priestess who cursed the area, the eerie singing that echoes through the trees at night. I always thought it was just local folklore, tales to keep kids from wandering too far. My family has been fishing these waters for generations. I practically grew up on the boat with my dad, pulling in catfish and crawdads, navigating the murky channels and thick cypress groves. The swamp is peaceful most of the time, the kind of place where you can lose yourself in the rhythm of the water lapping against the boat. One evening, I headed out alone. It was late summer, and the air was thick with humidity. I planned to set a few lines, catch enough to fill the cooler, and head back before dark. I just passed a familiar bend when I saw something bobbing in the water. At first, I thought it was just debris. The swamp's full of old logs and garbage that wash in from the river. But as I got closer, I realized it was a doll. An old, waterlogged rag doll, wrapped up in moss and tangled in a bit of fishing line. It was filthy and stained, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it looked wrong, like someone had tried to drown it. I pulled it in with my net, planning to toss it on shore later. That's when I noticed something else. Carved into the wooden post at the end of my boat was a small symbol, a rough triangle with a jagged line through it. I hadn't seen it before, and it looked fresh, like it had been scraped with a knife. I rubbed at it with my thumb, but it didn't budge. Shrugging it off, I kept fishing, trying to ignore the way the swamp seemed quieter than usual. Even the cicadas were unusually silent. As the sun dipped lower, I packed up and started the motor. The engine sputtered once, twice, then cut out completely. I cursed under my breath, pulling the cord to restart it. Nothing. I grabbed the paddle and started rowing, but the water felt thicker than usual, like I was pushing against molasses. That's when I heard it, soft singing, carried on the humid air. At first, I thought it was just the breeze through the reeds, but the melody was unmistakable. It sounded like an old Cajun lullaby, low and mournful, drifting from the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just someone on the far shore, but there were no other boats, no sign of people. Just me and the swamp. I picked up the pace, forcing the oars through the water. That's when I noticed the doll. It was lying on the floor of the boat, soaked and grimy, but somehow closer than where I'd tossed it. I knew I hadn't moved it, and there was no way it could have slid that far on its own. I kicked it back toward the stern, trying to focus on paddling. Then, something splashed beside the boat. I jerked around, just in time to see ripples spreading out from a dark spot in the water. I stared, trying to make out what caused it, but the surface was still. The singing grew louder, the words too faint to make out but undeniably human. Desperate, I tried the motor again. This time it roared to life, and I didn't hesitate. I steered for the narrow channel that led back toward the dock, my heart racing. Just as I rounded the bend, I glanced back, and my stomach dropped. The doll was upright now, propped against the seat as if someone had carefully placed it there. Its faded eyes seemed to stare straight at me. I slammed on the throttle, not caring about the wakes I left behind. Back at the dock, I threw the doll onto the shore and tied up the boat, my hands shaking. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again, so I left it there, hoping the swamp would swallow it. As I walked back to my truck, I heard the singing one last time, faint and mournful, like a warning. I didn't sleep that night. My thoughts kept drifting back to the doll, to the way it had seemed to move on its own. The next day, I drove back to the dock to check if it was still there. It was gone. The only thing left was the faint, muddy outline where it had been. I didn't go back to that part of the swamp for weeks. But one evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I took the boat out again, this time with my cousin, Joel. We didn't talk much, just fished quietly as the sun set. Joel was casting his line when he froze, his face going pale. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained to listen, and there it was, the same haunting melody, soft and distant. Joel turned to me, eyes wide. "Who the hell is singing out here?" I didn't have an answer. Then, just as I was about to suggest heading back, something splashed against the side of the boat. Joel leaned over, and his face twisted in confusion. "It's a doll," he said, pulling it up. I stared, heart pounding. It was the same rag doll, drenched, stained, and wrapped in moss. Joel dropped it like it burned him. We didn't stick around to see what would happen next. As we sped back to the dock, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. Just beyond the bend, barely visible through the dense cypress trees, I saw something moving. A figure, tall and gaunt, half submerged in the water, watching us with hollow eyes. We never spoke about it again, but sometimes, when I'm out on the bayou, I swear I hear that lullaby drifting on the wind. I don't fish that part of the swamp anymore, and I haven't seen the doll since. But deep down, I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. I stayed away from Manchac Swamp for weeks after that night. I couldn't shake the memory of that doll, how it seemed to move on its own, and the way the singing followed me back to the dock. Joel and I didn't talk about it. We just knew not to bring it up, like some unspoken rule. But despite my better judgment, The swamp kept calling me back. Fishing was more than just a hobby, it was how I made a living. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was all in my head, a mix of fatigue, superstition, and too much time spent alone on the water. One evening, just before sunset, I decided to head back out. This time, I made sure to bring some extra gear, a flashlight, a heavier paddle, and even my old hunting rifle. I told myself it was just precaution, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The air was thick with humidity, and the swamp seemed quieter than usual. I eased the boat into the water and headed for one of my usual spots. The fish were biting, and for the first couple of hours, everything seemed normal. No strange noises, no eerie singing. I was starting to feel like maybe I'd just imagined the whole thing. But as the sky darkened and the cypress trees cast long, twisted shadows, I felt it again, that creeping sense of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the shallow water. Just as I was packing up to leave, I heard a splash nearby. I whipped around, my heart pounding. There, floating a few feet from the boat, was the doll. It bobbed gently in the water, staring up at me with its faded, sewn-on eyes. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I hadn't seen it since the night I threw it on the dock. I pulled out my phone and took a picture, figuring that if anyone accused me of losing it, I'd have proof. As I snapped the photo, the water around the doll began to ripple, like something was moving underneath. I didn't stick around to find out. I fired up the engine and pushed the throttle, speeding through the narrow channel back toward the dock. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but the doll was nowhere to be seen. When I got back, Joel was there, packing his gear for an early morning trip. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind when I stumbled onto the dock, out of breath and rambling about the doll. "You mean the one we saw last time?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "Yeah, it's back," I insisted. "I swear I saw it in the water." Joel just shook his head. "You're stressed, man. Take a break from the swamp for a few days." I wanted to argue, but I knew how it sounded. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just another trick of the mind. Maybe some old trash floating back from the deeper parts of the bayou. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the window, half expecting to see the doll staring at me from the yard. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed, a text from Joel. "You out on the water? Thought I heard your boat." I stared at the message, confused. I texted back, "No, I'm home." "Why?" His response came almost immediately. "I swear I just saw your boat pass the dock. Someone's out there." Thought it was you. Panic surged through me. I hadn't moved the boat since getting back, and I knew I'd tied it up securely. I didn't bother to text back. I just grabbed my flashlight and rifle and bolted outside. The boat was still there, tied up where I'd left it. I shone the light over the water, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. The swamp was still, almost unnaturally quiet. As I walked back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. A small wet footprint on the dock, right next to where my boat was tied. I knelt down, examining it closely. It was tiny, like a child's, with faint, muddy streaks leading off toward the reeds. I followed the tracks to the edge of the water, where they seemed to disappear. That's when I heard it again, the singing, louder this time, like it was right beside me. My flashlight flickered, and I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing there. Instead, I saw the doll. It was propped up against the dock post, its head tilted to the side. I swore I could see moisture seeping from its fabric, like it had just crawled out of the water. My hand shook as I reached for it, but before I could touch it, something splashed in the water right behind me. I whipped around, pointing the light toward the source. The surface of the swamp was rippling, but there was no one there. I glanced back at the post, and the doll was gone. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. The singing faded, replaced by the sound of frogs croaking and insects buzzing. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, I called Joel and told him I was done. No more late-night fishing trips, no more solo outings in the swamp. He tried to convince me it was just stress, but I could hear the unease in his voice. I think part of him believed me, or at least believed that something wasn't right. A week later, Joel stopped by, looking pale. He didn't say much, just handed me his phone. There was a video, shaky, low quality, but clear enough to make out what he'd recorded. The footage showed his boat, drifting slowly through the water, with the doll sitting upright on the bow, facing the camera. He swore he hadn't touched it, hadn't moved it. The video ended abruptly when Joel dropped his phone, cursing. "We don't talk about it anymore." I haven't been back to that part of the swamp since. But sometimes, at night, I still hear that song, soft and haunting, carried on the breeze. I keep telling myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know it's not.